Now, listen to part of a lecture in a theater class.
As we've seen, over the course of the 19th century, British theatre changed dramatically. Despite your studies, you've probably never heard of James Planché. He was an individual who had one of the most profound, and least recognized, impacts on British theatre. Planché was born in 1796 in Piccadilly, London. By the age of 14, he had already written several amateur plays, and was apprenticing with a bookseller in an attempt to sell them. By chance, an actor happened upon one of Planché's early plays, and recognized the potential it contained. This actor performed the play at Drury Lane, and Planché's writing career began. However, most of his early plays were described as unremarkable. Until 1820, his most notable play, called The Vampire, was known most for the presence of a trapdoor which allowed actors to seem to disappear beneath the stage, and reappear as if from nowhere. This play, however, was not notable for what Planché would later become famous for: costuming. As was typical in other plays of the time, the vampire used costuming that was not realistic to the situation. The play was set in Scotland, and the actors wore costumes that would clearly convey to the audience that they were Scottish, but in stereotypical or unrealistic ways. For example, in the opening scene, a woman is shown hiding in a cave. She has been forced into it because of a storm that began raging while she was on a hunting trip, yet she is wearing a formal Scottish ball gown, complete with jewels. Planché realized that this was ridiculous. The costumes were not realistic to the situation the actor was supposed to be in. In other plays, actors would wear modern clothing, despite the play being based in the past. Planché believed that costumes should be accurate to a play situation. In 1823, he published an article saying that more attention should be paid to the time period of the play, particularly Shakespearean plays. At the time, actors in these plays would wear modern clothing, despite the fact that the plays were written over 300 years prior. Finally, people were beginning to recognize him as something outside the ordinary. He was given control over the Shakespearean play King John. He kept the actors and sets relatively unchanged, but spent an incredible amount of time planning the costumes. His publications before the play was produced, he published a 22-costume book which detailed, with historical accuracy, the costumes of all of the major characters. The book was remarkable because it made no reference to the theater, the actors, the Shakespearean text. It just went into significant detail about how the costumes should be constructed and how they should appear. Planché was not just creating costumes tailored to the actor, but also tailored to the play itself. Though the actors in King John seemed to think that this adaptation of Shakespeare might be a flop, it enjoyed great success. The accurate costuming made it easier for audiences to imagine the setting of the play. His time period costuming was so successful that Planché went on to design historically accurate costumes for all of Shakespeare's histories, and 7 of his non-histories. You know, his style of costuming with historical accuracy, rather than using unrealistic costumes, became the standard for Shakespearean plays for the next century. Planché's desire for historical accuracy in costuming seemed almost obsessive. He would extensively research the appropriate time period for each play, and clearly stated that he preferred accurate costuming to fanciful costuming. But his loyalty was to the play over the time period. For example, in researching Hamlet, Planché determined that the appropriate setting was 8th century Denmark. A Danish prince of that time would have worn scarlet, which is a brilliant red-orange. Yet one of Shakespeare's characters remarks that Hamlet, the Danish prince, is wearing sable, which is a dark brown-black. Planché wrote of this problem and said he wished the contradiction wasn't there, but in the end, he costumed Hamlet in sable, keeping with Shakespeare's original vision. From Shakespeare, he moved on to using historically accurate costumes in new genres. When he transitioned to Greek and Roman mythology, he used his costumes for comedic effect. He produced a play in which the characters were dressed in completely accurate Greek costumes, yet played a modern British card game. The irony of seeing realistically ancient costumes juxtaposed with the modern actions of the actors was a hit, and soon other writers began copying the technique. The amount of time and research Planché put into all his costumes was widely recognized. Historians consulted him about the correct placement of armor and other artifacts well into his retirement. Playwrights continued their attempt to create historically accurate costumes for the next 100 years.
Now answer the questions. Number 1. What does the professor mainly discuss? Number 2. According to the professor, how did Planché change traditional Shakespearean plays of the time? Number 3. What can be inferred about the actor's views of Planché's work on King John? Number 4. What is the professor's opinion about the relationship between James Planché and later playwrights? Number 5. Why does the professor mention Hamlet? Number 6. What are 2 notable features of Planché's costuming preferences? Choose 2 answers.
Okay, everybody, settle down. Come on, guys. I know all the world's a stage, but right now this is a classroom. Okay, then, let's get started. Maybe you think that as actors, your job is to memorize lines and go out and act. And maybe that's true in a simplistic sense, but thinking about it that way produces bad acting. Your job isn't to act, it's to live on stage. Acting isn't acting, it's living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. How do you do that? How do you build a character, as they say? Well, I'd say there are 3 components: what you do long before the performance, what you do right before the performance, and what you do during the performance. Most bad actors only do the first properly, if that. So what do you do long before the performance? Besides memorize lines. I can see what you're thinking. You're preparing to be bored while I drone on about writing your character's biography and other stuff you already know. Well, I suppose it's true that you need to know the person you're playing. But that's really a very small part of it. You know, when I was your age, when I was young and pretty, I went to a very serious acting school. And on the first day, the founder, a renowned teacher, said, the problem with college actors is they worry about why they're doing things instead of worrying about what they're doing. Think about living truthfully again. In life, do you worry about why you're at the grocery store? Or the laundry, or the audition, for that matter? No, you're thinking about what you want to accomplish, what you want to do. And when you're with another person, you're thinking about what you want from them, whether it's information or money or love or sex. And that's how it should be on stage. So, while you do have to know your character, you should spend most of your preparation and rehearsal time figuring what you need to do or accomplish in each scene. And how are you going to make the other people give you what you want? That's what you're on stage for, not to prance around and display your emotional or physical beauty. And you'll notice I said need. If you want your work to be believable, which is to say good, it's not about self-display or self-indulgence, it's about giving your needs urgency. Make it important to you. An acting coach once told me, if you're going to play Hitler, you have to think you're right. But what about that emotion? That's the work you do right before you go on stage. Emotional preparation, which means being in the right mood for the scene. Perhaps you've heard of sense memory? Recalling events in your life that put you in the appropriate frame of mind. Another approach, which I was taught, involves fantasizing or daydreaming about the appropriate situation. In theory, that approach makes you more accessible instead of withdrawn. But you have to be specific. If I want to be sad, I don't just repeat my mother died. I dream about how I saw her walking up the street when this car, an old, banged up, red Mustang, skidded off the road and the grill plowed into her in the small of her back and her body. See? I'm getting all choked up. Now, you're on stage for your scene. And this might sound funny, but let go of your preparation. Trust that it will be there. Remember this, in life, people don't try to be upset. In life, people don't try to cry, they try not to cry. So what are you supposed to do on stage? You're supposed to really do things. Watching anyone really do something is interesting. Haven't you ever watched someone thread a needle or make a cappuccino? It was fascinating, right? What's not interesting is watching people pretend to do things. Like most sitcom actors. So, instead of hanging on to your preparation, just do what you're supposed to do. Really shake hands, really threaten someone, really pour the tea, really ask the question, and this is the hard part, really listen to the answer, even though you've heard it 100 times before. Okay, that's what you want to work on this week with your partner. Really doing things. Quit acting. Just listen to them and answer them. It takes a lot of energy at first. People forget that acting is a craft and an art. If we were here to learn to play the violin, or throw a slider for that matter, you'd expect to practice for years before someone paid you a lot of money to perform. So don't get discouraged. And break a leg.
Now answer the questions. Number 1. What aspect of acting does the professor mainly discuss? Number 2. Why does the professor ask the students to think about living truthfully? Number 3. The professor says that, to play Hitler, you have to think you're right. What point does that example illustrate? Number 4. What warning does the professor give about emotional preparation when he daydreams about his mother's death? Number 5. What does the professor imply about most sitcom actors? Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question. Why does the professor say this?
It takes a lot of energy at first. People forget that acting is a craft and an art. If we were here to learn to play the violin, or throw a slider for that matter, you'd expect to practice for years before someone paid you a lot of money to perform.
Now answer the questions number 6. Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
The word novel means new. Or, really, it derives from the Italian novella, which can mean short story of something new. Interestingly, most European languages use a version of the French word roman, derived from romance, and an allusion to the medieval epics that fathered them. Actually, fathered is a controversial point. While some scholars agree that Don Quixote, written in 1605, was the first novel, others argue that that is an ethnocentric view that ignores a rich and older tradition in Asia. We'll return to that point in a bit. So what is a novel? Fairly or not, the classical and medieval European epics of knightly heroism, quests, and courtly love do not meet the modern definition of a novel, which is said to have an individual perspective, rounded characters, and some sort of psychological insight. Note that the use of prose instead of verse is not a criterion as, despite the popular misconception, the shift to prose came long before Don Quixote. However, prose lent itself to novel writing because each sentence leads to the next, while verse is a much more static form, partly because it is so much more symmetrical. Changing socioeconomic factors also encouraged academics to trace the birth of the novel back to the 17th century. A simple assumption would be to attribute this to the rise in literacy. However, while that was certainly a contributing factor, in the 200 years after Don Quixote, the publication, and presumably the readership, of novels increased far faster than the literacy rate did. One reason for this is that printing and paper itself became much cheaper. However, a less obvious factor was the evolving legal system, particularly changes in libel laws. Before roughly 1700, novels were not differentiated from histories. That distinction came about afterwards, allowing an author to be much freer in the choice of topic and plot if it were a fiction that was being presented instead of a fact. And, thus, he or she was much freer from being sued by someone. Consequently, novels delved further and further into realism. By the 19th century, the novelistic interest in realism led to in-depth portrayals of all classes of society, seemingly a far cry from stories exclusively about knights and damsels in distress. Authors such as Charles Dickens and Émile Zola were famed for such explorations of lower-class life. Of course, this was not a requirement, and one need look no further than the Brontë sisters to find works that retained a romantic focus. These works remain accessible to modern readers, as shown not only by their sales, but also by their use as sources for popular motion pictures. The final feature of the modern novel emerged in the beginning of the 20th century. Following the lead of D.H. Lawrence, modern novels now usually portray the inner monologues of their characters. Previously, novelists largely used the device of a narrator to advance their stories. Let's return to the issue of Japanese and Chinese novels. The Japanese work, The Tale of the Genji, meets the previously mentioned standards for a novel. And it was published in the year 1010. Furthermore, many works that should be considered novels were written in China before the 14th century. So, besides narrow-mindedness, why have these works been ignored? One reason is that just as novels proliferated in Europe, production declined in Asia. Another possible reason was that Japanese and Chinese cultures at the time valued permanence and the status quo rather than change and progress like in Europe. Thus, Asians read and reread their classics. There was much less demand for fresh creations. There is another cultural reason that might prove more interesting. There were fewer new works created in Asia because novels commanded more respect as art. Let me explain. As high art, these books were meant to be studied, as one might study philosophical or theological works, not raced through, for, say, enjoyment purposes only. In fact, many Chinese novels were published with accompanying commentaries that rivaled the books in length. And even though these were long books, editions without such notes were unpopular. An old Chinese proverb roughly said, "Without a pen, it's not really reading." Obviously, such an approach dampened demand. Speaking of demand, one quick final thought for you to consider. In Europe, and of course in the United States, novels came to be thought of as an embodiment of the bourgeois, or middle class, culture of merchants and entrepreneurs. In a way, that is very ironic because, despite the evolution we have discussed, the heroes of Western literature are usually not bourgeois. They remain nobles, and much like the heroes of medieval epics. Think about it this week. Most protagonists of books and films are modern knights, needing adventures and undertaking quests to find wealth or love.
Now answer the questions. Number 1. What is the lecture mainly about? Number 2. According to the professor, what was the advantage of prose rather than verse in novel writing? Number 3. Why does the professor mention Japanese and Chinese cultures? Number 4. What does the professor say about the differentiation of novels from histories starting around 1700? Number 5. Why does the professor say this?
An old Chinese proverb roughly said, "Without a pen, it's not really reading."
Now, answer the question number 5. Number 6. What does the professor imply when he says this?
In a way, that is very ironic because, despite the evolution we have discussed, the heroes of Western literature are usually not bourgeois. They remain nobles, and much like the heroes of medieval epics. Think about it this week. Most protagonists of books and films are modern knights, needing adventures and undertaking quests to find wealth or love.
Now answer the question number 6. Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
Now, we can't really discuss story arcs without first talking about what a story is, because to understand an arc, you have to understand what you're talking about in the first place. So what is a story? How would you define a story, Carlos?
Well, a story is something, I think, that has a beginning, middle, and an end. Apart from that, I would say that it's about something that happens to a person or a group of people. And within these rules, I think stories can be very different.
That's right. Stories vary in terms of what their beginnings, middles, and ends are, but what they have in common is that all stories share these features. By features, I mean the structure of a story, that it can be divided into these 3 parts. So any story could be broken down into its 3 main components: beginning, middle, and end. Okay, so what about story arcs? Because we've talked now about the structure of a story and the 3 pieces that make it up, but we haven't talked about how those pieces connect to one another in a meaningful way. Lindsay?
Well, I think a story arc would probably refer to what the plot of the story is. Like, what actually happens in the 3 parts. For example, a common story arc is the Cinderella story arc. She's sad and alone, then a really good thing happens to her at the beginning because she gets to go to the royal ball, which is a dream come true. But then in the middle, it gets bad again when she has to flee from the ball at midnight, and the prince can't find her. She has lost her love, they're separated. Then at the end, it's happy again when he does find her. So the arc of the story is sad, happy, sad, happy.
Good description. The Cinderella story arc, sad, happy, is a common one in literature. There are a handful of common story arcs like this one, 5 or 6 that repeat themselves in great novels. How do we describe a story arc that does the opposite of the Cinderella story, that starts happy and ends sad? Actually, that story arc, we will come back to in a few minutes.
I thought a story arc was the same thing as the plot. And there are more than 6 plots in the world.
Good point. They are not exactly the same thing, although the plot follows the story arc. The story arc is going to be a more general description of the emotional state of the person the story is about. Like Leslie said, when she described it as happy and sad, you might think of story arcs on a spectrum from happy to sad. The story arc is how you would graph the character's journey. Where were they the happiest, and where were they the saddest? Plots, on the other hand, are more specific. There are as many possible plots as there are specific details that you can dream up in your mind. The plots in modern Western literature are extremely varied. There are thousands and thousands of them. They mostly, however, conform to standard story arcs. One of the standard story arcs we have identified, the Cinderella story arc. Another common arc, the one I hinted at a moment ago, is the tragedy. In a tragedy, things start out fine, but by the end, something so terrible has happened that it is heartbreaking. Tragic. Obviously, this is why it's called a tragedy. If you think about some classic stories, you can come up with what other ones might be, right? There's what we call rags to riches, which starts sad and builds to a happy ending. That title is based on the legend of a person working his way up in the world, from wearing rags to owning riches. Then there's the arc we refer to as Icarus, based on the famous Greek myth. Icarus was imprisoned with his father on the island of Crete. To escape, his father created wings out of wax and feathers for them to use to fly out of the prison. His father warned him not to fly too close to the sun, but he didn't listen. He flew so close to the sun that his wax wings melted, and he could no longer fly. He fell into the sea and perished. So this is a type of tragic story arc that starts off sad, then becomes happy, then ends sad again. An interesting phenomenon to study is how some story arcs are more popular during certain times and certain cultures. The Icarus story arc, for example, is not nearly as popular in contemporary America as the Cinderella story arc. Why do you think that is?
Now answer the questions. Number 1. What is the lecture mainly about? Number 2. What does the professor mean when she says that story arcs and plots are not the same thing? Number 3. Why does the professor clarify what she means when she discusses the features of a story, including the beginning, middle, and end? Number 4. What does the professor say about stories that follow the tragedy story arc? Number 5. In the lecture, the professor discusses the characteristics of story arcs and plots. Select from the 5 statements below 3 that characterize story arcs and 2 that characterize plots. This question is worth 2 points. Number 6. Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Icarus was imprisoned with his father on the island of Crete. To escape, his father created wings out of wax and feathers for them to use to fly out of the prison. His father warned him not to fly too close to the sun, but he didn't listen. He flew so close to the sun that his wax wings melted, and he could no longer fly. He fell into the sea and perished. So this is a type of tragic story arc that starts sad, then becomes happy, then ends sad again.
Why does the professor say this?
So this is a type of tragic story arc that starts sad, then becomes happy, then ends sad again.
Now answer the question number 6. Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class.
Today we're going to talk about evaluating works of art in a special way. We're going to discuss art forgery. Art forgery is a special kind of crime. It's not like murder, and not even that much like robbery. That is, if it goes undetected, there isn't really a monetary loss. And if it is detected, it often damages only reputations, not people or property. And forgery itself is not a crime. The crime is usually fraud. Furthermore, convicted forgers get off relatively lightly, usually serving only a few years in prison. This is partly because they are not viewed with the same contempt as other criminals. In fact, the general public often admires them because they fooled members of the cultural and financial elite, almost like a cultural Robin Hood. Not only that, many find fame and fortune after their short sentence. They either live off their exploits or even find an audience for their own work. I can see that some of you are finding this an attractive proposition. Well, there's some truth to that. Aside from the points I just mentioned, the reality of the art world is that it is very vulnerable to such schemes. To understand that, we have to discuss aesthetics and art evaluation on the business side of the art world. Art has been copied and forged since ancient times, starting with classic Greek vases in Roman days, continuing through fake religious relics in medieval times, and, yes, there's the forgery of paintings, which I'm sure was your first thought. But even though the value of a work of art is tied to its genuineness, the art world isn't very good at establishing authenticity. Although, in all fairness, there are big problems. One method of determining whether a piece is authentic is through evaluating provenance, that is, the paper trail of ownership. But paper is fragile. A lot of it is destroyed by fires, wars, and other catastrophes. Sometimes it disintegrates or disappears over the course of a few hundred years. And, of course, paper itself is easier to forge than artwork. On top of that, it has been suggested that at least half the works of masters before, say, 1800, have been lost. We know they existed from diaries, contracts, and such like, so maybe some of them will turn up. But, of course, they will be without provenance. Okay, so, expert appraisal is another theoretical safeguard. But that has problems, too. Lately, experts in a variety of fields have been denounced or had their expertise called into question. Well, in the art world, there's some justification for that. Until very recently, a few decades ago, really there were no objective criteria for certifying experts in art appraisal. Scientific methods such as laser and X-ray examinations of artwork are an even more recent development. So, in some ways, expert appraisal was a confidence game. And even legitimate and honest practitioners partly base their opinion on feelings as much as on brush strokes, pigments, and so forth. But keep in mind that many painters, notably during the Renaissance, had studios where assistants and apprentices also contributed to the master's work. So often it was practically a guessing game. In the 1930s, there was a famous forgery case in Berlin involving Van Gogh paintings. Not only did different experts hold different positions, but some of them changed their views diametrically back and forth during the course of the investigation and trial. Typically enough, the eventually convicted forger, a fellow named Otto Wacker, I kid you not, received a sentence of less than 2 years. This trial, though, was one of the first cases where scientific evidence, a chemical analysis of the pigment, was employed. Okay, so you might think that since then, employing scientific methods has pretty much solved this uncertainty, right? Yes and no. Without a doubt, advancement and utilization of science has improved the accuracy of authentication. But there's a problem there too. Over time, wood panels and canvases age, and the paint itself can crack. So, many verifiable masterpieces have been subjected to undocumented restorations of varying quality hundreds of years ago, but also hundreds of years after the originals were created. In these cases, scientific analysis of the composition, age, and origin of the materials can be confusing, even deceptive. As recently as 1993, some works purchased by the Getty Museum in Los Angeles were found to almost certainly have been forgeries, despite appropriate scrutiny. Modern art museums are powerful institutions, and, thus, they vigorously protect their reputations. Consequently, the Getty on that occasion and the Metropolitan in New York, on another, stonewalled the authentication process, and sued to prevent the unmasking of expensive purchases as dubious. So, to this day, the Latin cliché certainly still applies to art purchases. Caveat emptor, buyer beware.
Now answer the questions. Number 1. What is the lecture mainly about? Number 2. According to the professor, what is one problem with provenance? Number 3. Why does the professor talk about the 1930s Van Gogh forgery case in Berlin? Number 4. Why does the professor mention undocumented restorations? Number 5. The professor mentions 4 aspects of art authentication. Indicate the order in which they are presented in the lecture, first, second, third, or fourth. Number 6. What does the professor imply when he says this?
Modern art museums are powerful institutions, and, thus, they vigorously protect their reputations.
Now answer the question number 6.